Hello and welcome back. This is the week 3 lecture. So today I would like us to discuss those 4 examples of fiction that I posted to the week 3 module. So I gave you guys an example of an epic, an example of a novel, sort of a traditional novel, and then 2 different short stories. So we're covering pretty much all of the major genres of fiction that we talked about last week: the epic, the novel, and the short story. So now that we've learned the basics concerning fiction, the basic elements, we learned a little bit about the history of fiction last week, the development of these different genres. Now that we know the basics, I think it's time to apply what we learned last week to these texts that we are reading this week. So I wanted to go through each one. I don't want to tell you everything about them because I want you guys to discover some things for yourselves. And of course, I would like you to sort of interpret these narratives on your own. But what I would like to do is talk specifically about some of those elements of fiction that I went over last week. So I want to talk about plot, character, setting, and also that narrative situation or the point of view. Those key elements that we talked about, I want to discuss them in relation to each one of the 4 works of fiction that I posted this week. So hopefully you'll have time to read all of them. We are definitely not reading all of the Odyssey, nor are we reading all of War and Peace. So I linked you guys to a couple of websites where you can read these texts for free. But remember, we are just reading book 1 of the Odyssey, and then we are only reading the first chapter of War and Peace. If you want to go beyond those opening chapters, feel free, but I'm only requiring those small excerpts from the 2 really long works of fiction, and then please read the 2 short stories in their entirety. So let's start with the Odyssey, a very famous example, of course, of an ancient epic. So we talked about epics last week, and we said they are a little bit weird because they were usually composed in verse, which means they are written like works of poetry. They're written in verse, not prose, at least traditionally. They were traditionally recited orally, most likely, often accompanied by music or some kind of performative aspect, and then only later were they set down on paper. But we lump epics in with novels and short stories, even though they are often written in verse. Whereas novels and short stories, like we said last week, are written in prose. The reason we do this, it seems a little counterintuitive, but as I mentioned last week, epics actually have more in common with novels than they do with other works of poetry. In terms of plot development, in terms of character development, epics are kind of similar in a lot of ways to modern novels. Now, of course, epics are generally not modern. They are generally very old, and this is no exception, but they do have a lot of the same elements that we'll find much later in novels, and to some extent in short stories as well. So we start with an epic. And we talked about these as being very common in ancient societies. Virtually all ancient civilizations had their own epics, and they were all somewhat similar in certain ways. Of course, they all had different qualities, but a lot of them featured those sort of heroes' quests, journeys, battles against various forms of adversity. So, we get a little bit of that flavor here. Again, we're not reading very much. We're only looking at book 1, but we can see some of the familiar elements of the epic on display here. So, at the very beginning, we get some exposition from our omniscient third-person narrator. So I want you guys to notice that when we were talking about the different stages of plot back in week 1, we talked about exposition as kind of the initial stage. It's usually the first part of a plot. Not always, but certainly with traditional narratives, with traditional works of fiction like this one. You don't get much more traditional than this, going back to about 800 BCE. Here we start with some exposition. That's pretty common. Exposition just means sort of background information, basic info that readers will need to know in order to fully grasp the story. So we get some of that in the very beginning, and again, it's delivered by our omniscient third-person narrator, and then we move on to a conversation between the gods. So we actually go to Mount Olympus, the house of Zeus, here referred to as Jove or Jupiter. One kind of weird thing is that we get the Roman names of all of these gods. That's just the translation that I happened to have my hands on. So we get the Roman names for a lot of these Greek gods and figures. So in this case, Odysseus is referred to as Ulysses. Some of you might have read translations like this in the past, but don't be confused. It's the same characters, just different names for them. So after the exposition, we go to Mount Olympus, where we listen to the gods talking. And then we get to the main action of the plot, which takes place in the house of Odysseus, where his son, Telemachus, is sort of struggling with all of these suitors who are hanging out at the house, basically trying to win the hand of his mother, Penelope, who they presume to be a widow, because at this point Odysseus is obviously missing. He's presumed to be dead. He's not present for this first chapter, this first book. So Telemachus here kind of functions as our protagonist, so we spend most of our time with him in the house on the island of Ithaca. But we begin with the gods. So this is a sign that we have an omniscient third-person narrator, because the narrator knows everything. The narrator can take us to all these different places. We can listen to a conversation between the gods, and then we can go to the house of Odysseus, and we can learn about Telemachus and what's going on there. So the omniscient third-person narrator is very much in charge here. And this narrator is delivering a lot of information to us throughout Book 1. So as you remember in Chapter 2, what we read last week told us that having an omniscient third-person narrator was very common in ancient epics. Well, we see it here. So that's no surprise. So the plot kind of continues a little bit. Up in Mount Olympus, we learn that the goddess we usually refer to as Athena, here called Minerva, she decides that she wants to go down there and help Telemachus out. As we know, if we know anything about the Greeks or the Romans, in their narratives, in their fiction, they often had gods sort of interacting with humans or kind of meddling in human affairs. That was often a key part of their plots. So we have that here. Minerva comes in the disguise of this guy, what's his name? Mentor or Mentees, this like local chieftain. So she comes in disguise to basically tell Telemachus that he needs to seek out more information about his father. He needs to take a journey like to the Greek mainland or to Sparta somewhere. I don't remember. He's supposed to go to a couple of places and talk to some different people and gather some info about what's happened to his father. So she gives him that advice in the form of mentor, and then she disappears. So we hear that conversation. We learn a little bit about what's going on with Telemachus, how he feels. He's obviously not really happy. He's not very pleased to have all these suitors around. So not only are they competing for Penelope's hand, they're also eating all the food and just really making themselves at home. They're really sort of becoming nuisances. They're taking advantage of the family's wealth, and Telemachus obviously resents that. So he has the conversation with Minerva, and then we have a local bard who, sort of like Homer, these would be like sort of itinerant artists who would recite poems for audiences, and they might also do a little singing or play a flute or something. But these were the types of storytellers that would have been common in this really early period of Greek history. So keep in mind, this was written around, we don't know exactly, but around 800 BCE, but the events of the plot are supposed to have taken place even further back in time. So we're really back at a sort of archaic stage of history here, perhaps even before the advent of recorded history. So that's our setting. We're on the island of Ithaca, for the most part, off the west coast of Greece in the Ionian Sea. We start on Mount Olympus, but most of the narrative action, most of the plot, takes place in the home on the island, and we're at some very distant point in history, long ago. So this bard at the house kind of reminds us a little bit of Homer, the type of occupation filled by Homer. And these were common performers in ancient Greece, and again, they would have been reciting these poems orally. So the bard, Phemius, he's performing in the midst of all of this sort of rowdiness. The suitors are all drinking and sort of, having a lot of fun, too much fun from the perspective of Telemachus. So actually a lot's happening here if we're just looking at the plot of the first book, because again, that's all we're reading. Obviously, the plot of the Odyssey is very extensive, very complex, and a lot happens, but we're just looking at this one very small excerpt. But actually a lot is happening here. We have the performance, we have drunken suitors, and we hear a little bit from a couple of those guys. We get a couple of, exchanges of dialogue. Telemachus kind of engages some of them in conversation, not always super friendly conversation, and then he goes to bed. That's basically the end of the chapter. He has a sort of give and take with some of the suitors after Phemius gets done performing and after Minerva leaves, and then he just kind of gets tired and decides to go to bed. And I think he talks to Penelope at some earlier point. But we kind of conclude with him being led up to his bedroom, his chamber, by his favorite servant. We learn a little bit about the servant, and then he goes to bed still thinking about Minerva's advice, thinking about this voyage that he needs to undertake. So that's where we leave off, and that's all we're going to read. But even within this small excerpt, there is a pretty clear plot. There are several events, but because we're at the beginning of the overall epic, all we're really getting so far is exposition and a little bit of rising action. We haven't gotten to a lot of the other narrative events, but we're getting the beginning, essentially. We're getting this thing set up for us. So we see that omniscient third-person narrator, just to go back to POV, or the narrative situation, as the book calls it. So remember, this would be authorial narrative situation, the first type defined in Chapter 2, the first point of view type defined by the book. So that means that we have a kind of obtrusive third-person omniscient narrator. So it is a godlike narrator who knows everything and can take us anywhere. We can access all kinds of different information. But what comes along with a lot of traditional omniscient third-person narrators is sort of this constant narrative presence. Like the narrator is always kind of there, talking to us, the readers, delivering information to us, telling us about different characters, telling us about things that happened previously, giving us access to some characters' inner thoughts, giving us background, giving us that exposition, moving us around. So we're always very aware of the narrator. The narrator is very present in the text. Now, the narrator is not a character in the story. This is a detached third-person point of view. This is a narrator sort of hovering above the action, not taking part directly in the action. But the narrator is always there. We're always aware of the narrator being present and giving us a lot of info. So just keep that in mind. And again, the setting, we start on Mount Olympus, but we're mostly on the island of Ithaca, which is a real place. I mean, that's a real island off, I think, the western coast of Greece. And then the time period is a little foggy, but it's long long ago. And we also have a lot of different characters here. A lot of them aren't getting developed a whole lot, but obviously Telemachus is our protagonist. Now, Odysseus is the protagonist of the overall work of fiction, but he hasn't shown up yet. We don't see him yet. We hear him talked about a little bit, but we don't actually see him. Penelope appears briefly. Minerva appears, and she talks in disguise as this other guy. We hear a couple of the suitors. We don't learn a whole lot about them, but a couple of guys stand up and talk during this scene. Eurymachus, a couple of others, I don't know. We don't know much about them so far. And then also Phemius, the bard. He doesn't really get much to do. I mean, he's kind of performing in the background. We don't actually hear his poem, but we know that he is performing and people are enjoying his work, I guess. So there's a handful of characters, but remember what we learned last week. In epics, a lot of characters tend to be kind of flat, which means they're not always developed. Remember, we would have more individualization of characters with later kinds of fiction, with novels, with short stories. That would come later. In epics, especially a lot of the important characters, they were supposed to represent bigger things. So they often weren't very realistic. They didn't seem like real people. They were more symbolic because that was important at this early stage of history. Remember, the book says a lot of epics and other early versions of fiction were very allegorical. They were very symbolic. The action on screen or on the page was supposed to kind of represent larger truths or larger concepts that would have been very important to that culture, to that society. And we definitely see that in the Odyssey. Okay, so that's it for our first example. Let's move on to the novel. So I want you to read chapter 1 of War and Peace, sort of a classic novel written by Leo Tolstoy, a Russian, back in the 1860s. So I chose this for a couple of reasons. Number one, it gets mentioned in chapter 2 of our textbook. So if you flip back to pages 26 and 27, you'll notice that they offer a short passage from War and Peace, from the first chapter, as an example of authorial narrative situation. That really noticeable, omniscient, third-person narrator that's delivering a lot of information to readers. We definitely see that. But I wanted us to go ahead and read that entire first chapter just to get a flavor of how this book reads, because it's an example of a novel, and just like we don't have time to read an entire epic, we don't have time to read an entire novel, but this chapter will give us at least a sense of what's going on and just how big this work of fiction really is. So Tolstoy is kind of famous for his big, sprawling novels. They're kind of epic in nature. That's why we can sort of see a connecting link between ancient epics and early novels, because they deal with often sort of historical events, maybe loosely based on real life historical events. Remember, historical novels were pretty popular throughout the 17 and 1800s, and they're still popular today. So there's this kind of sprawling epic quality. A lot happens. We have a lot of characters, a lot of subplots. It's kind of complex, and obviously we're not getting much of that in the first chapter, but we can see a few of the key elements of fiction already on display here. So we don't need to get too far into the plot, but we will talk about the key elements. But first, I just want to throw out one more reason why I chose the first chapter from War and Peace, because this is a sort of classic novel, a very famous novel. Much like Moby Dick, a famous American novel, this is the kind of book that you've probably heard of. You've probably heard the title War and Peace, even if you've never read it. Much like Moby Dick, it's famous enough to where the title typically gets recognized, even if we've never actually opened up the book. But what's interesting, if you remember in chapter 1, they talked about how these different boundaries or these different definitions of genres of literature, in this case, genres of fiction, these boundaries can be kind of blurry. And a lot of times what we think of as a novel might actually have elements of other types of writing mixed in. And that's very much the case with War and Peace. So that they don't talk about this in the textbook, but Tolstoy, when asked about the book, which was of course very popular during his lifetime and still is today, but he claimed that it was not a novel. He did not consider it to be a novel. Because a lot of the later chapters were sort of more about like history or philosophy. In some cases, they contained what we might even call text types. If you remember chapter 1 in our week 1 discussion about these sort of non-literary texts, like newspaper articles, or, nowadays like social media might qualify, or just other types of writing that would not have been considered literature traditionally, like a work of history or a work of philosophy. So the whole reason Tolstoy was saying, well, I don't really think War and Peace is a novel, is because he had these sort of text types inserted along with the narrative that he was telling. And he said, especially towards the end of the book, I really move away from the narrative. And he said the book is more of a philosophical discussion by the end than it really is a narrative. But people didn't really listen to him, and we continued to refer to this as a novel. And interestingly enough, if you look at Moby Dick, another very famous novel, it's kind of the same way. I mean, there is a narrative at work all the way through, but certain chapters in Moby Dick have nothing to do with the larger narrative. They're about all of these other things. They're about whaling, or they're about history, or they're about different kinds of ships. Again, text types, not really literature. I mean, Melville's pulling from history and geography and the first-hand accounts of like sailors and, cartographers and stuff. So a lot of that wouldn't be considered literature. And he has entire chapters, just like Tolstoy with War and Peace. They have entire chapters like that, where we don't even see the narrative, and then we might get back to the fictional narrative in the next chapter. But we still call them novels because that's easier. But just remember, like the example they used in chapter 1, Pale Fire, another novel that has a lot of non-novelistic stuff in it. But because it gets complicated to try to categorize things like that, we just call it a novel and we move on. But Tolstoy, again, is sort of referred to and thought of as a sort of master of the novel. So the plot, let's not get too far into it. Let's just stick to chapter 1. Again, we don't have to worry about the whole book because we're just reading chapter 1. So again, we're sort of having some things established for us. A certain amount of exposition is being provided, and we're only meeting 2 characters. But they are important characters, and they're going to play pretty big roles in the larger narrative that unfolds. But what you need to know is we are in the early 1800s. The setting, the historical setting here, is the early 1800s. I believe 1805 to be exact. So this is during the Napoleonic Wars. We don't need to talk about this at length. I don't know a whole lot about them, but this is, you guys know Napoleon Bonaparte, the sort of French general and the ruler of the nation for a short time. He was sort of at war with the rest of Europe for a while, and amongst the many other countries he was fighting against Russia. So those Napoleonic Wars are going on. Okay, or they're about to, maybe. I'm not sure if they've already started or if they're on the brink of starting, but that's where we are historically. And obviously we're in Russia, the city of St. Petersburg to be exact. But in terms of plot, basically the whole novel just revolves around these 5 aristocratic families in Russia, and we learn what happens to them over the course of these wars. That's the briefest summary that I can provide. And in chapter 1, basically all we see is a conversation between 2 characters. Anna Pavlovna, I think, and then the prince, Vasily Karagan. I cannot pronounce their names. We'll just call them Anna and the prince. So those are the two characters we meet. This is a party or a salon that Anna is hosting. So if we kept reading, if you go on to chapter 2, you'll actually meet some more characters as they show up. But the prince has arrived early. Nobody else is there yet. So in chapter 1, it's just the prince and Anna talking. But their conversation will help to provide some of the exposition that the readers need to be able to understand what happens later. So that's all the plot we need to know. That the war, these wars are kind of the backdrop, and we're about to meet a bunch of characters at this social setting, this social event hosted by Anna. So again, we only have two characters here, but through their conversation, we learn about some other characters that we're going to meet soon, including the children of the prince. He has 3 kids. We don't meet them yet, but we hear about them. We hear them described, and we will meet them pretty soon in the novel. So again, they're going to be important characters, so we're first learning about them here. And we once again have a very noticeable, omniscient, third-person narrator, like we said. So the narrator has access to a lot of information, and he is giving us a lot of information. So once again, we have the authorial narrative situation, that omniscient, that godlike third-person narrator. And just like what we saw in the epic, this narrator is making himself very present. He is very noticeable because he talks a lot. He's delivering a lot of information, a lot of descriptive detail, and access to at least one character's inner thoughts. So this narrator knows a lot. He knows events that have happened in the past. He has access to the content of personal letters. He knows specific information about a lot of different characters. So you might remember when we were learning about character last week, we talked about the fact that some characters can be presented by a narrator by being shown to us. In other words, we observe the character talking, doing things, and that's how we learn about that character. Or the character can be told. We can learn through telling. A narrator can just tell us about characters. And that's often what we find omniscient third-person narrators doing. They'll sort of introduce characters to us and say, hey, there's this person. Here's what he's like. There's this person. Here's what she's like. So we get a little bit of that from our narrator here in chapter 1. These two characters are kind of described to us by the narrator, but we also hear them talk to one another. So we also learn things through their conversation. But once again, this type of point of view, this omniscient third-person narrator who's a little bit obtrusive and almost functions like another character. Not a character in the action, but he talks so much and he does so much, the narrator, that he almost fills a role comparable to the role of a character. So just like in the epic, we saw a lot of these kinds of narrators in early novels. So this novel was published serially in installments over the course of the 1860s. But that was still only about 100 years after novels kind of got up and running. If you remember our brief history lesson from last week, novels kind of came into fashion during the 1700s. So in the 1860s, we're still kind of in the early days of novels. So writers like Tolstoy kind of helped to increasingly popularize this genre. And by the end of the 1800s, novels were often regarded as the most popular type of fiction and really maybe literature in general. And we're kind of seeing that development play out. So again, look on page 27. They talk a little bit as well. I just kind of used a lot of their points, but they talk about this point of view, this narrative situation that we see here. And it is another example of that authorial narrative situation. So again, we're comfortable with these omniscient third-person narrators, but they do a lot of work for us. They present a lot of information to us. I want you to notice that in the next text, the short story by Ernest Hemingway, we see a different kind of narration. We see a different point of view in many ways. So let's move on to a clean, well-lighted place. Oh, well, I kind of forgot to do setting for War and Peace, but I've already covered a lot of it. Russia, early 1800s, but one more thing. We're in a salon. And that's kind of an important word to know here, and it sort of has two meanings. On one level, a salon can refer to a physical space, an actual room in a large house that would often be used for social gatherings, and that is where we are. I mean, we're in Anna's house, and we seem to be in a room like that. But also a salon back in the 1800s would have referred to an actual social gathering itself. Usually held at a private residence, often the private residence of a prominent woman like Anna, who knows a lot of the main characters in this narrative, and people would come over to talk about politics or art, other current events of the day. So both of those definitions are kind of operative here. We're in that sort of a room, and that kind of a social gathering is about to happen, and it will begin really in chapter 2. In chapter 1, we just have the prince, an early arrival, and we just hear him talking to the hostess, Anna. Okay, so let's move on to Hemingway. A clean, well-lighted place, very famous short story, first published in 1933. And of course, Hemingway's a very famous American writer. So it's important that we're at least a little familiar with him, and a lot of us have probably read him in the past. You might remember last week I said a lot of short stories historically have been published in newspapers and magazines. And that is true here. This was originally published in Scribner's, which is a literary magazine. It's still around, I think. It's still published to this day. But this was published almost 90 years ago. So it's kind of old by our standards, but in a lot of ways, Hemingway helped to modernize U.S. fiction writing. And even if we haven't read a lot of Hemingway, he's one of these names in America that most of us are familiar with. Even if you don't know a lot of his work, you're probably at least somewhat familiar with certain aspects of his style. He was a former journalist, so he's often known for writing relatively short, simple sentences. Now, not all of his sentences are short, but compared to a lot of his contemporaries, compared to a lot of other writers working in the early 1900s, he had a very sort of lean, straightforward, some people almost call it kind of a muscular style, without a lot of extra flair. He sort of cut out a lot of description. He cut out a lot of exposition. He cut out a lot of the additional details that other authors would have mentioned. Like a journalist, he often focuses on sort of the bare bones, the most important facts, basic movement, the most important information, and then he sort of cuts out the rest. And I think we'll notice that as we get into this text. So he doesn't always offer a ton of description and explanation, although he does provide some. But again, his descriptions are a little bit more bare bones than maybe some other descriptions from other writers. And we probably know that Hemingway is in ideas surrounding masculinity, changes in the modern world, isolation, alienation. He was an ambulance driver and a war correspondent during World War I. So he kind of came out of that experience somewhat disillusioned and jaded. He kind of documents a lot of the instability and change that really characterized the first half of the 20th century. So he's kind of famous for all of that. So even if we haven't read him, we're at least a little bit familiar with him. But this short story, first of all, he is considered a master of the short story form. So we're moving on to short stories now, and we can actually read all of these in their entirety because this one in particular is quite short, as you'll notice. So we do have a plot here. Even though not a ton happens, we can still define a clear plot. There are events, we get a little bit of exposition, and we can track the events of this plot. So it's late at night in a cafe in Spain, and there's an old man drinking brandy alone. There are two waiters working in the cafe, and they are serving the old man and sort of waiting for him to leave. And one of the waiters, the younger one, is impatient. He's being a little bit rude to the old man. He wants to hurry up and get home. And then the older waiter is a little bit more patient, more tolerant. And we hear them have a long conversation. And then we eventually leave the cafe with the older waiter. And then we follow him to a bar, and then later we're sort of headed back home with him. So that's the plot, and as we know, not all plots contain fight scenes and explosions and, earth-shattering events. A lot of plots consist mostly of kind of mundane, everyday occurrences, and that's what we see here. So we have some characters, not many, but we have the old man, and we have the two waiters. We also have a bartender who we see briefly towards the end, and that's pretty much it. It's a very short story, so we don't have a very large cast of characters. But remember that distinction, again, between telling and showing. So Tolstoy's omniscient third-person narrator tells us a lot about the characters. Here, we really learn more by just observing the characters and listening to the characters. The narrator tells us some things. The narrator does give us some info, but not a whole lot. And a lot of what we learn about the characters, we learn by listening to them talk, by observing their actions. So that's a little bit of a different technique. This is a different style that we're seeing here. This is a different method of characterization, a different way of developing characters, introducing them and developing them so the audience can get to know them. So notice that difference. So here, if we're talking about the narrative situation, or as I would prefer to call it, the point of view, this is still a third-person narrator at work. Okay, we don't have a first-person narrator, so this is third person, but it's not authorial anymore. It's not the authorial narrative situation. Now it's the figural narrative situation, that third type that we have a definition for in Chapter 2. The figural narrative situation means that we have a third-person narrator, but that narrator is not omniscient, not godlike, and not nearly as noticeable as a typical omniscient third-person narrator. So our narrator here in this short story tends to disappear. Like, the narrator definitely exists, and if you look at the beginning, the first paragraph provides some basic exposition about the old man drinking, kind of where we are. We get the setting established a little bit, and we do have some brief exposition. And then we get another paragraph pretty early on where the narrator kind of describes how the waiters are sitting, or kind of describes how things are located. We get a little bit more detail. But then after that second paragraph, that kind of comes straight from the narrator, our third-person narrator, who's not a character in the story. Detached, outside the events, but not godlike, not hovering over godlike like the omniscient narrators we saw before. This detached narrator, this sort of this different kind of third-person narrator, he shows up sometimes, and we sort of hear him and see the information that he's providing, but then at other times, he sort of disappears. So after those two early paragraphs, where the narrator does give us info, notice that long conversation between the two waiters. That conversation goes on for a pretty long time, and the narrator doesn't do a whole lot during that conversation. The narrator does step in to give us a little bit of detail about movement, about how the characters are moving, or maybe gestures that they make. And we get a little bit of narration, but notice that it's kind of bare bones. It's not super elaborate. It's not super detailed, and it's certainly not as detailed as what we got in chapter 1 of War and Peace. So this is a different style of narration. It's still third person, but like they say in chapter 2, there's a big difference between a non-omniscient third-person narrator and that godlike omniscient third-person narrator. They're different. Even though they're both third-person, the effects created are very different. A lot of the non-omniscient third-person narrators kind of disappear. They make themselves invisible. They are not as prominent. They don't draw as much attention to themselves. So I want you to notice that with Hemingway's narrator. Yeah, he does appear, he does deliver info, and he provides a lot of info towards the end of the story. But I want you to notice that towards the end, it becomes apparent that the older waiter really is the protagonist of this story. He's the main character because we leave with him. At first, it's not immediately apparent that he is the main character. When I first read this text, I assumed the old man would be the protagonist because we kind of start with him and then we meet the waiters. But it turns out that the character we spend the most time with, the character who we learn the most about, is the older waiter. So notice when they close up the cafe for the night and the old waiter leaves, we, the readers, leave with him. So again, this is what's weird about the non-omniscient third-person narrators. In this case, we almost adopt the perspective of the old waiter. He's not telling the story. So we don't have first-person narration, but we sort of occupy his mind. We sort of inhabit his mind towards the end of the story. I want you guys to notice the end of the story when we leave the cafe. We almost begin to hear the old waiter talking to himself as he walks the streets, as he goes into a bar. We hear him talk about how he doesn't really like bars. He would prefer to find a cafe, a clean, well-lighted cafe like the one he works at. See, he can sympathize with the old man for wanting to stay late at night alone in a nice cafe like that. So the old waiter goes to a bar, doesn't really dig it. He has one drink, then he leaves. And we're in his head. The narrator is in his head. So this narrator doesn't really have access to other characters' thoughts. And this narrator doesn't really seem to know everything that's going on in this time and place. Again, he's not omniscient. But this narrator does know what's going on inside the mind of the old waiter. But remember last week, I was talking about some of these techniques that have been developed in recent, like within the last century, for this kind of third-person narration. These kind of new techniques like stream of consciousness or free indirect discourse, where our third-person narrator disappears and almost inhabits the perspective of the main character. So I read you that excerpt from Elmore Leonard, if you made it to the end of last week's lecture, an example of free indirect discourse, where Leonard, who's a pretty contemporary author, his narrator is delivering information in the voice of the protagonist, but not putting those words in quotation marks. It's not actually dialogue. It's like the inner thoughts of the protagonist in the voice of the protagonist, but delivered by the third-person narrator. So I don't know if you guys find this as interesting as I do, but it's complex, and it's kind of an interesting thing to observe, and Hemingway does it too. Not quite as much as Leonard, but if you look at the very last sentence of the short story, that's a statement, that's a thought that the older waiter is saying. That's the waiter talking. that last sentence, it's not really the narrator. I mean, the narrator is delivering it, but it's in the voice of the protagonist. But notice it's not in quotation marks. It's not treated as a line of dialogue, because really the character is talking to himself, as we know. He's talking to himself. So these are inner thoughts, but they're in his voice. So at the end of the story, we almost feel like we are experiencing things from the perspective of this protagonist, even though our narration remains third person throughout. But this is a more modern technique. Notice, we're getting away from that old school, old-fashioned, omniscient third-person narration style. Hemingway's doing something different. Something that we would perceive today as being more modern. So hopefully that makes sense. And as far as the setting, again, we're in Spain. I think Madrid, probably the 1930s. Again, we don't have a time period. That's one of the things that our narrator, kind of slipping around, not always visible, he doesn't give us that information. He doesn't even tell us what city we're in. I'm just guessing that it's Madrid. I don't really know that. But I think it was meant to be like the time period is supposed to be contemporary to the time in which the story was written. And it was written in 33. So I think we're in Spain during the 1930s. But here's a case where the historical time period matters. Not because Hemingway is really doing historical fiction per se, but if you know anything about the history of Spain, and Hemingway certainly did, he was interested in Spain, he liked Spain, he visited Spain as both a correspondent, a journalist, and as a tourist. But if you guys know anything about Spain, you know that the Spanish Civil War took place during the 1930s. It didn't break out until like 36, I think. I'm no historian, but a few years after this story was published. But still, it might be important to know that the 1930s, I mean, that's a pretty significant decade in Spanish history. Okay, so let's wrap things up with Hacienda by Catherine Ann Porter, our final example for the week. This is another short story, but you'll notice that it's longer than A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. It's a little bit more developed. There's more going on in terms of the plot. There's a lot more characters. We have a much bigger cast. So it's just kind of a more expansive, a lengthier short story. So I just wanted to give you guys an example of a really short story and then a longer short story, so we can chart some of the differences. This piece by Porter was published in 1932, 1 year before Hemingway's story, and this piece was also published in a periodical, in a sort of a literary magazine. The name escapes me, but I know it was originally published in a periodical at about the same time as Hemingway's work. So these are two important American writers who are considered masters of the short story form. But just one interesting side note, Porter would later return to this text, and she would make it even longer. So if I don't have it in front of me here, and I don't feel like digging for it, but if you have her collected works, which I have somewhere buried under other books, if you have her collected works, the version that appears in that is the longer version, which is about 40 pages long. Still a short story, just a pretty long short story. And she develops the plot even more, and she gives us even more information about the characters. So, as you can see, the plot and the characters here would really be comfortable, could be comfortable in a full-length novel. Like, we have enough material here, we have enough potential plot material to make this a much longer work. And she obviously realized that as well. But notice how the effect created by reading this is a little bit different than the effect of Hemingway's story. Hemingway's story is very neat and tidy, and it all takes place in just a handful of locations. The cafe, the bar, we're back on the street. It all happens in one night. You know, we only have 3 characters. It's all very small in terms of scope. But here we have a much bigger scope. This could be a novel. So just remember that there are short stories like this as well. So the plot's pretty complicated. I don't want to get too deeply into it, but just understand that a movie is being made. That's what's happening here. A movie is being made on a pulque plantation in Mexico. Pulque being an alcoholic beverage made from like the fermented sap of the some kind of tree that's native to Mexico. So they're on this plantation, this hacienda, owned by a wealthy Spanish family that's owned it for, generations, going all the way back to when Mexico still belonged to Spain. This film crew has come to the hacienda to make this movie. That's what's going on. But the central conflict that gets introduced, remember that part of the plot, we always have a conflict, we always have some kind of a complication. In this case, one of the peasants, or as they're described, and they're referred to in the text as peons, they're the peasants who work on the plantation for this wealthy Spanish family. One of the peasants accidentally shoots and kills his sister with a pistol, and then he is apprehended and thrown in jail. And this event sort of slows down production on the movie. So that's kind of roughly what's going on, and we're meeting all of these different characters. A lot of them remain sort of unnamed, and that's a weird thing that Porter does, that she actually changes later on. So when she returned to this text and expanded it, she gave everybody a name. But here, all the Russian guys just get referred to by the first letters of their names. But this is mostly a Russian film production. So the director of the movie is a Russian guy. And then the cameraman is also a Russian. The assistant cameraman is a Russian guy. But there's also a sleazy American producer. His last name starts with K. And we learn a little bit about him. He's very racist. He doesn't like Mexico. He doesn't like Mexican people. So we learn about him. We hear a little bit from him. And there's a lot of other characters too. There's Don Gennaro, the guy who owns the plantation. Gennaro, I don't know. There's the narrator as well. So let's move into the narrative situation here, because we have a different one. For the first time, we are seeing a first-person point of view, a first-person narration style. So remember last week I said first-person narration is usually provided by the protagonist or the main character of a work of fiction. But sometimes, like in The Great Gatsby, the first-person narration is provided by a minor character who kind of observes all the action. They're not the main character, but they're present for a lot of these important events, so they're describing everything and they're telling the story. That's what we get here. Our nameless narrator, she is telling the story from a first-person perspective, but she doesn't seem like the main character, really. I mean, she's kind of an observer. She delivers a lot of the information, but she doesn't seem like a central player in all of the things that are going on. But she is physically present. She's not detached completely. She's there. She's physically present. And she does take part in some conversations, in some of the actions. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that she is definitely the protagonist. She kind of serves as more of an observer, almost more of a supporting character. But she's a screenwriter who's been brought in to work on this movie. So not all of that is explained. She is not like 100%. She is the narrator. So she tells us things about these other characters. She tells us things about Pulque and about Mexico and a little bit about Mexican history and about this hacienda, but we don't necessarily get as much definitive info as we would get from an omniscient third-person narrator, because obviously she's not omniscient. She doesn't know what other characters are thinking. necessarily. She can speculate, but she can't tell us the inner thoughts of other characters. She can't jump back and forth in time necessarily. She does tell us about past events, but she can't predict the future. She can't go to Mount Olympus. She is somewhat limited. All she knows is what a person could know, but she does know a lot. She certainly knows a lot about Mexico, and she knows a lot about other characters. So she delivers a lot of info. And for much of the short story, we don't really notice her all that much because she's not always immediately present in the action. A lot of the other characters are a little bit more active, but I would argue that changes a little bit towards the end. Near the end, she kind of takes on a little bit more of a presence as she's sort of sitting and wrapping herself in a blanket. And again, she's observing things, but we also get access to some of her thoughts. But really only her thoughts. She doesn't have access to other characters. So we do get a first-person point of view here, unlike the other examples. And the setting, once again, the historical time period matters here. So we are in the 1920s. There are several hints that help us to understand that. The narrator does not directly tell us that, but we can deduce it based on some evidence. So on one hand, we hear about Hollywood a little bit. The American producer comes from Hollywood. And the 1920s was sort of the beginning of the golden age of Hollywood filmmaking. Also, there were several prominent Russian filmmakers, believe it or not, at work in the 20s. And if you know Porter, I mean, this is not necessary for us to know, but Catherine Ann Porter, the author, worked in the movies. She was an actress for a minute, and she also wrote screenplays. So she was very interested in the movie industry, and she knew a lot about it. So people who study her and know a lot about her fiction will often say that this story is actually kind of loosely based on a real Russian director who was active in the 20s. So if you read the longer version, I wish we had it, it's just not online. The longer version of this story, the Russian director is Uspensky. We learn more about him, and he's sort of a stand-in for this real-life director named Eisenstein, who was making movies back in the 20s. You don't have to worry about that, but Porter probably had that in mind because she was kind of a movie buff. So this is kind of this plot is kind of loosely based on real people and maybe some real events. Eisenstein really did go to Mexico to make films in the 20s. And other Russian directors did too. So there is a little bit of fact here. But of course, it's pretty much the actual story itself is pretty much all fiction. But you also need to know that the Mexican Revolution ended in 1920, just a few years prior to the events of this narrative. So that matters. And our first-person narrator is often talking about the Mexican Revolution, and she mentions names and events and things that happened previously in history. But that's not because she's omniscient. That's just because all of that stuff has already happened, and it's still kind of fresh in people's minds. So she does give us some history, but she's not an omniscient, godlike narrator. She just knows a lot about Mexico. Porter in real life did too. She traveled there. And also, most Americans in the 20s would have known about the Mexican Revolution because it was in the papers. It was talked about and reported on, and obviously we're Mexico's northern neighbor, so we knew what was going on, at least to an extent. So we get some of that history here, but to a modern reader who's not familiar with the revolution, it might be a little strange. But yeah, so different style here. Porter is known as a very subtle, at times a very ambiguous writer. Like, we don't always really get her themes, like her larger meanings. Whereas Hemingway, I would say, is just as complex, but because of his style, sometimes people think that his stuff is easier to read, easier to understand. But I would argue that his story also delivers a little bit of a mysterious message, maybe a little bit of a downer of a message that we kind of have to figure out as well. So I think we covered everything. Hopefully you enjoyed at least one or two of these examples of fiction, and we're going to continue to do this as we cover all of the major branches of literature. So next week we're going to go back to chapter 2 and we're going to read about poetry. We're going to cover the basics. We're going to learn the basic elements, a little bit about the history, a little bit about different types of poetry, and then in week 5 we're going to read examples of poetry that will be posted to Web Campus. So let me know if you're having any issues, and I will see you next week.